Okay, I think we'll make a start. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cardiff Book Talk. I'm Anna Mercer and I'm a lecturer in English literature at Cardiff University. This is Book Talk's 10th anniversary season, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what is our first ever online session too, which has, I think hopefully proved popular with attendance. We've got 106 people here now. Cardiff Book Talk is the book group with a difference. Our expert speakers address a piece of classic or contemporary fiction from the perspective of their own specialism. And this can lead to fascinating insights about the literary, social, and cultural implications of the novels that we read. Tonight, we are discussing Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which was first published in 1962. This is a novel that upends the traditional haunted house of the horror genre with an enigmatic and ambivalent story that combines the tradition of the Gothic with psychological suspense and dark comedy. I personally found the tale of Merricat, Constance, Julian, and Jonas so gripping, and tonight we have the great privilege of welcoming three expert speakers to discuss the text. The format for this evening is 3 short talks, and then we'll go to a Q&A at the end. We've turned on captions for this event, but you can turn this off if you prefer. See the options at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Don't forget that you can follow us on social media, and if you enjoyed the event tonight, please let us know why by using the hashtag Cardiff Book Talk. You can also check out our blog and website for more Book Talk materials, including some extra reading on Jackson that we've been sharing in the build up to tonight. Okay, so without further ado, I'm just going to pass you over to my colleague, Dr. Christy Collins, who will be introducing our speakers for this evening. Christy and another member of the Book Talk team, Colin Bond, will be co-chairing this special event on Shirley Jackson. Okay, over to you, Christy.
Thank you so much, Anna. Hello and welcome to everybody. It's so great to be here. We weren't for sure if we would be able to continue this year, but despite everything, we have found a new way to bring you Cardiff Book Talk. So without any delay, let's get going with the event. So we will begin this evening with Shelly Ingram. Shelly is an associate professor of English at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Her research has focused primarily on the connections between folklore and 20th century literature, including the interplay between literature and belief, ethnographic narrative, and audience reception. She has written on the literature of Shirley Jackson as it concerns myth, ritual, food, and narrative. Her co-written book titled Implied Nowhere, Absence in Folklore Studies, which of course includes a chapter on Jackson, was published by the University Press of Mississippi in 2019. Shelley, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Of course, we practiced the screen share, and it is not working.
We can see it, Shelley, if that helps.
Yes, but it's not moving. There we go. There we go. As I said, thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm going to start by telling a story. A friend of Shirley's wants to unnerve her by telling her that his knapsack was a dead baby. And he said, "Which I shall eat tonight in the woods, roasted over a campfire." Jackson simply nodded her head and replied, "It's always nice to have a little snack along in case you get hungry." This exchange was recounted in Judy Oppenheimer's 1988 biography of Jackson, and it exemplifies some of the most prominent themes in her fiction: food and mothering and witchcraft, monstrous consumption, subversive womanhood. I'll talk to you tonight about a motif that frequently appears in Jackson's later work, one that gives notice to these themes as it weaves together food, the home, horror, and folklore, namely the story of Hansel and Gretel. So the thing about food in life and literature is that it matters. Food brings the past forward. It connects us to those in our present. It marks boundaries between insider and outsider, between parent and child, between friend and foe. Food, as Barth says, sums up and transmits a situation. It constitutes an information. It signifies. In literature, characters, unlike their physical counterparts, do not have to eat to live. That they do so says to the reader, pay attention. This is important. It signifies. Food certainly seemed to be important to Jackson. She wrote in an unpublished essay that the reason was rather simple. She said that she loved, quote, the beautiful and the lovely and the fascinating foods mankind has himself to inventing since he first learned to heat up meat. The wonderful imported candies, the elaborate desserts, the rich sauces, the cheese and the potatoes and the creams and the sweets. Witchcraft was also another one of Jackson's particular fascinations. According to her second biographer, Ruth Franklin, there were 3 dimensions to Jackson's character: writer, housewife, witch. As a serious student of witchcraft and magic, Jackson even wrote a children's history of the Salem witch trials for Random House in 1956. She enjoyed playing up this dimension of her character, though many of her contemporaries and later readers would take her claims to witchcraft as a game that she and her husband liked to play. However, Oppenheimer disagrees, arguing that Jackson in reality moved within the world of the supernatural, that she had the ability to see beyond reality, to pierce the veil into other realms, that Shirley was, in fact, psychic. Franklin, in her turn, sees Jackson's deep and abiding interest in witchcraft as something more metaphorical. It's literal, it's a symbol of female strength and potency, of powerful women who defied the bounds placed on them by society. But whether or not Jackson considered herself a real witch, it was clear that she loved witchcraft and she loved food, and she was very interested in countering contemporary narratives of womanhood. Re-envisioning the story of Hansel and Gretel allows her all of this. Fairy tale scholar Maria Tatar notes that food, its presence and its absence, shapes the social world of fairy tales in profound ways. Children's fairy tales thus abound with 2 things, with the threat of cannibalism and with food as literal wish fulfillment. If you remember in the story of Hansel and Gretel, the land is experiencing a famine. There's a man and his wife living with their 2 children. And the mother demands that her husband take her children into the woods and leave them because there's not enough food to feed the whole family. The children overhear this plan and they prepare. But the second time it happens is when Hansel drops his breadcrumbs, which are eaten by birds, which means that they are lost, tired, and desperately hungry. They then find and begin to eat a house built entirely from bread with a roof made of cake and windows made of clear sugar. The woman in the house, the witch, a figure with whom Jackson identified her whole life, built this house to lure children to her, as the story does. And as she brings them in to fatten them up for a good meal, it shows both food as literal wish fulfillment and the threat of cannibalism. Eventually, Gretel pushes the witch into the oven, right, saving herself and her husband. They take treasure from the witch's house and eventually make their way home. The mother-wife stepmother, importantly, has died while they were away, suggesting a clear link between the witch and the mother, though the father welcomes them back with open arms. The children in Hansel and Gretel are unusually active for fairy tale protagonists. They are working against the plan of the mother and the father all through, and they trick and vanquish the witch themselves without any supernatural aid. But we can also see how they ignore the gentle voice that protests the eating of the house and gorge themselves on sweets. As Bruno Bettelheim once famously said, showing how ready they are to eat somebody out of house and home. There thus exist multiple competing interpretations of the tale, from seeing it as a way to break children of their oral fixation, to a celebration of the Oedipus complex, to a parable of economic oppression. However we like to interpret Hansel and Gretel, though, there is something in it that connects the mother to both gluttony and scarcity, to hoarding, food, and violence to both parent and child. Jackson once said that she resented violently the fact that Hansel and Gretel eat the witch's house and never get punished for it. So she rewrote it, turning it into a musical called The Bad Children to be performed by students at her daughter's school. The children in the play were whiny brats, and she said, quote, "Every time I thought of something my children do that I can't stand, and there's a lot, I put it in for Hansel and Gretel." In Jackson's theatrical version of the story, the mother and father abandoned their children near the witch's house because the children are, quite simply, very bad. As soon as Hansel and Gretel find themselves alone, they rush to the witch's house and begin to eat it greedily. When the witch comes out of hiding to demand an explanation, Hansel says, "We're eating this little house, stupid." What follows is a give and take between the witch and the children, with the children demanding that they be incorporated into the familiar tale. In what is perhaps the most telling of lines, Gretel says, "We've got a right to eat this house, and you can just go ahead and catch us if you can, because everyone knows what's going to happen then, and I get to watch Hansel push you in the oven." When the mother and father passed back by the gingerbread house, the witch asked them if they have lost their children. "Oh, no, 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 no," says the mother, while the father says, "Children, what are children?" Jackson wrote this play at the same time as she was working on The Haunting of Hill House, which suggests that she was not only concerned with the witches, but also the house, with what it would feel like to have children nibble at your wall. It's telling that each of the great houses in Jackson's later house novels, which include The Sundial, The Haunting of Hill House, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, is that the houses are attractive and compelling from the outside, standing slightly apart from their surroundings and very rarely entered by outsiders. Plots are set in motion because someone somewhere could not resist the lure of these gingerbread houses and the mother witch inside. We Have Always Lived in the Castle is perhaps the most fairy tale-like of all of her fiction. We find out toward the end of the novel, of course, that Merricat is a murderer. Very little motive is given for the murders, except that Merricat was punished for being, in Constance's teasing words, a wicked, disobedient child who was sent away from the table without supper. This might not seem like much of a motive, but it starts to make more sense if you put it within the context of Hansel and Gretel. Carolyn Daniel argues about Hansel and Gretel that the primal experience between mother and child also involves absolute fulfillment, and that once the absence of food is realized, desire for its restoration swiftly follows. For Hansel and Gretel, the abandonment and hunger manifest in their instant succumbing to the lure of a house made of food, and in their entering the witch's home looking for a restoration of the mother. For Merricat, the only person in her family who had succeeded in feeding and caring for her was Constance, and the moment when food is withheld forces a realization that with the rest of the family gone, Merricat could finally restore and then strengthen that primal infantile bond with her sister. Constance has spent the years since her acquittal retreating into kind of a hyper-domesticity, which I'm sure some of our other participants will be discussing tonight. Always cooking and baking and gardening and canning. Constance is all that Merricat wants in a mother, a figure out of fantasy who comes to power through this act of violence. So with food and family annihilation, Jackson situates Castle within the world of the fairy tale. She further evokes the magic of folklore as she compares Constance to a fairy princess and peppers the story with dragon's teeth and nursery rhymes and Merricat's own protective rituals, a kind of magic Merricat practices to arrest time and protect her and Constance from the world. In fact, Merricat's rituals dominate the novel, serving as her most visible trait. When Cousin Charles arrives at the house, he clearly disrupts the stasis of Blackwood Manor and initiates the disorder that will propel the narrative forward. That Merricat directly links Charles's arrival here of her magic further intensifies the fairy tale qualities of the novel as she protects her sister and their home from the villain. One of Jackson's previous novels, The Sundial, directly engaged the Hansel and Gretel story. In it, the character of Oriana, a woman who probably murdered her son by pushing him down the stairs to secure her right to the house, has a Hansel and Gretel dream. She thinks, a place of my own, a place all my own, a house where I can live alone and put everything I love, a little house of my own. No one will talk to me and no one will hear me. There will be only one of everything, one cup, one plate, one spoon, one knife. Deep in the forest, I am living in my little house and no one could ever find me. In this dream, the children rush in to nibble at her walls and then lie about it, setting off a mob to carry Oriana away from her little house in the woods. In the sundial, the children nibbling at Oriana's walls reinforce her desire for isolation and, most of all, for control of the family estate. This desire is never fully realized, as she is foiled at the end by the actions of her own wicked grandchild, who probably pushes her down the stairs in the mirror of the opening act. In Castle, when the sisters return to their home the day after the village attacked it, they clean the kitchen and barricade the windows and eat and drink from the few dishes and the 2 cups that survived the assault. They sit in their house in the woods that now decidedly belongs only to them, and this is the fruition, down to the singularity of cups, of Oriana's Hansel and Gretel dream. A new order has been established in Castle. Uncle Julian has died, and the sisters now live alone in their homes as witches whose existence is sanctified by the actions of the villagers. Furthermore, Merricat and Constance have become, as parents tell their children, achieving what Gretel and the bad children really wanted, as the Blackwood sisters are incorporated into local lore. A mother tells her son that the sisters are scary women who will hold you down and make you eat candy full of poison, warning that they capture the little boys who get too close to the house and eat the little girls. Masking evil with sweetness, feeding to kill instead of nourish, and threatening not just death but cannibalism. These traits all position Merricat and Constance as outside the natural domestic and maternal order and connect them to the witch of Hansel and Gretel. As Merricat and Constance sit in their house discussing the omelets to be made from a young boy's offering of fresh eggs, Merricat wonders if she could eat a child if she had the chance. I doubt I could cook one, says Constance, though she's not denying cannibalism so much as lamenting her lack of a good recipe. Both of these responses reject a particular ideology of domesticity and mothering. Merricat could, and in fact did, kill a child, but as of yet has not eaten one like she's about to eat the boy's eggs. And when Constance rejected Charles's offer of marriage, she rejected the possibility of biological reproduction, and eggs for her are now only to eat. We see the shape of Hansel and Gretel, this new world that Merricat and Constance inhabit. In the novel are ovens and wombs, eggs and baked children, and since the threat of cannibalism is ever present in fairy tales about witches, children, and food, this scene reinforces the sisters' witchy dyad. That so many readers feel connected to and empathy for a fictional character who murdered her father, mother, aunt, and 10-year-old brother is an integral part of the novel's meaning making. Partly this has to do with Merricat's compelling first-person narration, as we see through her eyes the hostility of the villagers and their children. But I would also suggest that it is a testament to the power of the witch and the lure of her ginger home. Jackson's fiction suggests that children do indeed stay horrible into the end, and that witches are women whose sometimes destructive desire is simply to live an undisturbed life with a power that is fully their own. Her later novels find meaning through motifs culled from Hansel and Gretel, as they are full of food both nourishing and poisonous, sinister children, devouring mothers, and witches like Merricat. In these works are hungry women and the bad children who eat away at their homes and their bodies, who refuse to stop because of their own insatiable needs and desires. Jackson's novels reveal how witchcraft is a peculiar longing for her. But Jackson's wanted a little house to her with food enough to eat, as she's worried of neither scarcity nor gluttony. She uses Hansel and Gretel as a framework to offer up subversive versions of both womanhood and childhood that challenge the era's criteria for happily ever after. Thank you.
Shelley, thank you so much. That was amazing. I will probably have a few questions during the Q&A if I can slip one in about how a happy ending might work, the fairy tale happy ending in Castle. So I will save that for the Q&A, and we will switch over to Rob. I also want to say thank you, Shelley, for joining us all the way from Louisiana. That was great. Despite the distance, we were able to hear you and everything. So, okay, let's move over to Rob Lloyd. Rob is a postgraduate research student at Cardiff and submitted his PhD at the beginning of November. Go, Rob. His thesis examined representations of mostly women in a selection of Shirley Jackson novels, short stories, and autobiographical narratives. His most recent, His most recent publication was an article in a journal titled Women's Studies on Jackson's spectral self-presentation in her life writing collections titled Life Among the Savages and Raising Demons. And together with fellow BookTalk speaker, Dr. Joan Passey, he is working on an edited collection of essays focused on Jackson's under-examined short fiction. Welcome, Rob.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Crispy. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Appearing in September 1962 as her sixth and final novel, Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle was a culmination not just of an outstanding authorial career, but of one of the most significant and influential contributions to American Gothic fiction. Although Castle is her shortest novel by some margin, it is perhaps the best illustration of Jackson's command of the Gothic mode, one that she had near perfected by the time it was distilled through works such as Hangs a Man, The Bird's Nest, and, most significantly, The Haunting of Hill House. Whilst it has some connection with the work of literary forebears such as Edgar Allan Poe, one of the elements that make Jackson's Gothic writing so distinctive is its focus on the lives and experiences of women, and specifically the ways in which their situation in the world is unsettled, marked by a tension both with others and within themselves. The critic John G. Park summarizes this tendency by remarking that most of Jackson's protagonists are emotionally violated and must struggle desperately to overcome their estrangement and dislocation, and most of them fail. End quote. In some respects, this characterization forms a line that can be traced across Jackson's writing, ending up with the most unsettled and unsettling of all Jackson's female protagonists, Mary Catherine or Merricat Blackwood. In the brief time that I have with you this evening, I want to sketch out how just such a characterization relates to Merricat, whilst also pointing towards a more nuanced reading of her representation. While there is little doubt that she is a troubled figure, Merricat is also one of the few protagonists in Jackson's writing to achieve some degree of self-sufficiency and Gothic agency within her surroundings. I want to focus particularly on her relationship with her sister Constance and think about the forms their power takes within the novel. To do so, I'm going to draw on the work of such critics as Lynette Carpenter and her reading of Jackson's text, which she similarly understands as being concerned with questions of power, female power and self-determination. As she observes at the beginning of her essay, quote, female self-sufficiency, Jackson suggests, specifically women's forceful establishment of power over their own lives, threatens a society in which men hold primary power and leads inevitably to confrontation, end quote. My argument is that it is precisely this confrontation with representations of masculine patriarchal authority that enables both Merricat and Constance to secure their particular form of female-centric power. Although this power is limited in scope and defined within very specific parameters, it offers more security and surety to the sisters than is afforded to almost any other of Jackson's main protagonists. I don't want to suggest in all this that Merricat is a figure of unquestioned autonomy or is afforded unlimited personal freedom. As the opening chapter demonstrates, during her shopping trip to the village, she initially makes for a rather timid figure, someone who expects and encounters hostility wherever she looks, and which leaves her angry, but which she is ultimately incapable of challenging. The only power she can exercise over the residents is imaginative, wishing upon them unbearable pain and even death as they talk about and heckle her. While she certainly feels safer in the Blackwood home, even here she is met with a degree of challenge to her position in the form of Uncle Julian. Not only does he never acknowledge her or engage her in any kind of conversation, but he actually believes her to be dead, making her a kind of living ghost whom he consciously fails to notice. As with other of Jackson's young women, such as Natalie Waite from Hangs a Man, this ghostly simultaneity of visibility and invisibility is exacerbated by her adolescence, a condition which is frequently read in critical accounts as expressive of spectrality. Pamela Thirschwell summarizes this dynamic quite effectively when she says that, quote, ghosts resemble adolescents in that they are defined by their liminality, caught between time frames. If ghosts exist uneasily between the worlds of the living and the dead, then adolescents exist uneasily between childhood and maturity. Merricat's positioning between the categories of adulthood and childhood, reflecting elements of both without properly belonging to either, diminishes her presence in the world as she falls through the gaps between these more secure forms of identity. At 18 years old, as she tells us in the opening line of the novel, she is certainly on the cusp of adulthood, yet is consistently referred to as a child throughout the text, most noticeably by both Constance and cousin Charles. It's as if it were preferable to continually infantilize her rather than acknowledge her as a woman approaching legal autonomy. She has neither the presence nor the power to occupy a stable position by herself, which is why her relationship with her sister is so important. Constance not only chooses to see Merricat, unlike Uncle Julian, but unlike every other character, she does not regard Merricat as a figure to be tormented or loathed. They are each other's mutual support system. Constance relies on Merricat to leave the confines of Blackwood property to buy groceries, whilst Merricat sees in her sister a substitute mother figure, able to instruct and care for her. Together, these different roles might make it tempting to read the sisters as an opposite or inverse reflection of one another. Constance, the traditional, even unimaginative one, and Merricat, the unrestrained, creative, and imaginative one. Yet this rather blunt opposition overlooks important similarities between them, such as Constance's culinary creativity and the way in which she instructs Merricat about plants, both curative and deadly. Their relationship, in other words, is secured by an exchange of knowledge, as from parent to child or from teacher to student, and Merricat uses this knowledge as an essential part of securing some degree of power for herself. Rather than read Merricat as an aberrant form of feminine behavior that contrasts with Constance's more conventional and domesticated version, I think it's more instructive to read both women as desiring a form of sisterly solidarity that is self-sufficient and based on a rejection of change and intrusion from the outside world. As suggested, one of the forms this self-sufficiency takes is this knowledge of natural medicines and poisons that Constance shares with Merricat, a knowledge that ties both of them back to a lineage of female healers, that group of women who were executed for supposed witchcraft in 17th century New England. In many ways, the witch figure is the defining archetype for both Constance and Merricat. Indeed, Carpenter describes We Have Always Lived in the Castle as Jackson's rendering of a modern confrontation between witches and witch hunters. Yet the most striking description of the sisters as witches does not concern these forms of antiquated knowledge, but rather reflects a more mundane reality of domestic labour. Quote, when we had neatened the upstairs rooms, we came downstairs together, carrying our dust cloths and the broom and the dustpan and mop, like a pair of witches walking home. I think this is an interesting image for a number of reasons. It makes an unambiguous connection between the sisters and witchcraft as a practical form of femininity, one that reflects the day-to-day domestic life of women, particularly in the 2 decades or so following the Second World War. The Gothic potentiality of the image of the witch is repurposed here, indicating neither power nor knowledge, but rather underlining the uneasy occupancy that both Merricat and Constance have within the house. The Blackwood house, importantly, does, but also does not belong to Constance and also, to a lesser extent, Merricat. But it is also a space which does not yield to their full control because of its symbolic alignment with masculine power, particularly in terms of money and ownership. As Lily Robert Foley points out, the very notion of the house as a domestic space, certainly in the United States during the post-war period, is bound up with complex arrangements of gender representation. Quote, the house, which is both female mind and body, lives in ambiguous real estate. It is both the woman's sphere, yet the man's property, end quote. Despite a deep-rooted, though not necessarily positive, identification with the home, Constance and Merricat's ownership of it is compromised because it is symbolically identified as the property of their long-dead father, a trace of whose diminished but still extant authority is present in the form of his brother Julian, who serves as a barely living reminder of the Blackwood name. This perhaps explains why both of the sisters take care to maintain the house as it would have been when the rest of the family was alive, keeping their possessions immaculately clean, but rarely, if ever, touching or using them, with the exception of items such as their mother's harp. The sisters preserve the house as a moment in time as well as space, so that past and present exist in uneasy tension within it, heightening the sense of spectral displacement that Merricat already experiences through her adolescence. It is into this rather complicated dynamic that Cousin Charles arrives, an additional and far more threatening symbol of male authority. Although he is primarily a disruptive presence, this disruption is not rooted in the fact that he's a stranger. To the contrary, it's rather because he is a mirror image of the deceased John Blackwood. Constance remarks on more than once how much he resembles their father, and he soon occupies the latter's bedroom and begins to appropriate his possessions. He can be read as a form of paternal reanimation, returned to restore the proper line of succession of the Blackwood estate from man to man, with the novel implying that he intends to propose some kind of incestuous marriage to Constance that would redefine her as housewife rather than homeowner. However, it should be pointed out that Constance is not particularly interested in her status as homeowner. Aside from Merricat and Uncle Julian, the only things in the house that she cares about are her kitchen and the preserves in the cellar, which constitute a culinary genealogy of the Blackwood women that is kept hidden from the men of the family, which allows it to survive the vandalization of the house by the villagers at the end of the novel. While she may constantly be in the kitchen, this proximity to an accumulated female family history actually helps to secure her position within the house, embodying an alternative lineage to the monetary one privileged by the Blackwood men. It is the terrifying prospect of returning to this conventional organisation of the Blackwood family, represented by Cousin Charles, as well as her desire to remove any trace of him from the house, that leads Merricat to start the fire in her father's bedroom. In one sense, Merricat's destruction of the house to preserve it as a primary female space might seem counterintuitive, but it is only by doing this that she and Constance are able to reclaim it as theirs. Not only does it get rid of Charles, who is forced to leave without the safe, its contents being the only Blackwood asset in which he is truly interested, but it also banishes the ghostly presence of their father, both in the figure of Charles and in the destruction of his room, possessions, and, more generally, I think, the house as an economic prospect. With its roof and top floors gutted, it ceases to be an object of material value, as well as a focal point for anxieties about improper inheritance. The destruction repurposes the house as a site for a limited but still significant form of female seclusion and self-sufficiency, completing what Carpenter refers to as, quote, the transfer of power from Blackwood men to Blackwood women that began with Merricat's poisoning of the family 6 years previously. The parameters of the Blackwood sisters' power, in other words, maps onto the perimeters of the property just at the point when it becomes a ruin, when it no longer represents an economic or patrilineal prospect and instead becomes a site of refuge. The destruction of the house with which they are identified also underlines the metaphorical representation of the sisters as modern-day witches, which both Lynette Carpenter and Bernice Murphy point to in their interpretations of the novel. Merricat's repeated refrain throughout the novel of wanting to live on the moon becomes relevant here, I think. It is clear that her idea of living on the moon is not to be taken literally. Rather, it functions as a metaphor for an idealized form of existence, one that is very much recognizable as being rooted in the Blackwood home and her life with Constance. Quote, "I liked my house on the moon, and I put a fireplace in it and a garden outside. What would flourish growing on the moon? I must ask Constance. And I was going to have lunch outside in my garden on the moon." End quote. Her imaginative journey into the moon is a psychological safety net for Merricat, one she uses most frequently during moments of heightened disruption, such as the entire duration of Charles's visit. It functions as a mock Edenic space for which both Merricat and Constance strive throughout the novel, and in which they achieve in a rather distorted way by the end of the text. Quote, "I am thinking that we are on the moon, but it is not quite as I supposed it would be. To which Constance responds, "It is a very happy place, though." End quote. So whilst it would be possible to read these lunar fantasies as a manifestation of Merricat's delusional condition, I think they function as more than that. They encapsulate the desire both Merricat and Constance feel about separating themselves from a world that is, at best, indifferent to their real needs and selves, and at worst, openly and destructively hostile to them. Despite all the upheavals they endure, and in the wake of the fire and vandalization of the house, the sisters do find their own version of happiness in their situation. Merricat's final words, which are also the final words of the novel, underline this: "We are so happy." These words can be spoken with a degree of sincerity and surety in a way I think that very few, if any, of Jackson's previous female protagonists are able to do. And this is just one of the ways in which we have always lived in the castle leaves itself impressed on your imagination long after you turn the final page. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was brilliant. Well done.
Thank you.
Let's move to our final speaker of the evening, Joan Passey. Joan is a teacher in English at the University of Bristol and a researcher of the Gothic from the 18th century to the present day. She has published on Anne Radcliffe, Wilkie Collins, and Shirley Jackson, and most recently provided the video introduction for screenings of the movie Shirley to be shown at independent cinemas across the UK. Welcome, Joan.
Thank you so much. I think I jumped the shark there a little bit with the idea of cinemas across the UK, and I fear I may have personally led to mass lockdown by daring to have my face on a giant cinema screen. Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so pleased to be here. I enjoyed both of those presentations so much that for a glorious moment I forgot I was meant to speak. And I found it completely uncanny, actually, how well my paper draws together, well, how closely all of our papers are going to relate. And I hope that really comes up in the Q&A as well. It's almost a bit haunting, a bit spectral, very Shirley Jackson, the kind of accidental conversation that we've had. My paper today is going to focus on the economic side of Shirley Jackson's work, which has been touched upon already by Shelley and by Rob. So Shelley very interestingly referred to this idea of a house of one's own, a room of one's own, where Jackson seems to be quite consciously drawing on Virginia Woolf's idea of a room of one's own. And it's something, again, that Merricat repeats in the novel when she's talking about her own house on the moon. And Rob as well referred to this very central and important idea to We Have Always Lived in the Castle of home ownership and of female independence. Money, the lack of it or the earning of it or the limits of it plays a significant role in Jackson's significant body of work. Many of her narratives focus specifically on young women trying to earn money for the first time, striving for fragile independence, travelling with limited funds and exercising purchasing power. This fits with our image of Jackson as a career writer, generating a prolific output to sustain her family and household. It also resonates with contemporaneous mid-20th century concerns with money and gender, specifically shifting economies and increased numbers of women in the workforce. Money and exchange are often represented in spectral and disconcerting and fragmentary terms. Gail Turley Houston describes economics as an irredeemably Gothic body of knowledge and discusses how it is the phenomenon of capitalist crisis or breakdown that made the Gothic an indispensable supplement to economic thought throughout the long 19th century and, I argue, beyond. Monstrous and Gothic articulations of consumerism have mostly centred on the emergence of the vampire, but I would argue have taken on a new cultural currency, as it were, during the pandemic, where COVID is a beast enabled by an imploding capitalist culture reaching its limits, and the consumer rather than the citizen becomes valuable and human life dispensable. We are encouraged to eat out, to help out, to consume, even if we shall not survive. Women's labour in particular has become the centre of a discourse about capitalism as a patriarchal structure under lockdown. Women's unpaid reproductive labour has increased, while their paid labour has been disproportionately impacted by caregiving responsibilities, the loss of support networks, to name but a few factors. Gender, labour, death and threat are currently at the forefront of our popular imagination, and I will discuss how these concepts rupture through in Jackson's work. We Have Always Lived in the Castle opens with Merricat as a consumer going shopping, and she frames it as a ritual and a game. Merricat seems to be somewhat performing the role of the consumer, moving by rote, and the process is described in automatic, monotonous, repetitious terms. Throughout this opening, Merricat reflects on her family's wealth and status relative to the rest of their community. The people of the village disliked the fact that we always had plenty of money to pay for whatever we wanted. We had taken our money out of the bank, of course, and I knew they talked about the money hidden in our house as though great heaps of golden coins, and Constance and Uncle Julian and I sat in the evenings, our library books forgotten, and played with it, running our hands through it and counting and stacking and tumbling it, jeering and mocking behind closed doors. I imagine that there were plenty of rotting hearts in the village coveting our heaps of golden coins, but they were cowards and they were afraid of Blackwoods. When I took my grocery list out of my shopping bag, I took the purse too, so that Albert at the grocery store would know that I had brought money and he could not refuse to sell to me. This quote relocates the image of the monstrous aristocrat from 19th century Europe to 20th century America, something gestured to in the title, where the mansion is reimagined as the Gothic castle. This description of finances centers on fantasy, mythos, and imagination, essentially interrogating representation. Houston describes Gothic economics as concerned with currency as representative and the dissolution of meaning in the face of unstable representation. And I think you can also see this in the way that Constance ends up becoming a token or a representative of access to the Blackwood family wealth. That cousin Charles isn't interested in her, but in the property that she represents. Merricat and Constance are left vulnerable by the absence of Blackwood men capable of taking care of the finances. Man could get rich farming the Blackwood land. If he had 1,000,000 years and 3 heads and didn't care what grew, a man could get rich. Keep that land pretty well locked up, the Blackwoods do. Man could get rich. Too bad about the Blackwood girls. Never can tell what'll grow on Blackwood land. This image is insidiously sexualized, drawing the bodies of the Blackwood girls analogous with their land. They are the transgression that has sprung forth from this tainted soil. The repetition of man could get rich exaggerates the exclusion of women from these economic systems. The failure to conform to this system, to the gender binaries that underlie society, is portrayed as a larger perversion of femininity and its associations with nourishment and growth and fertility, and that manifests in this case in images of contagion, tainting the infected Blackwood land. Value lies in the property, yet the very property itself has been ruined by the transgressions of the Blackwood women. And not just the fact that they've killed off their family, but the fact that they're women who dare to own property. Women resisting their designated subservient position leads to the loss of value and to economic decline. Women and their place in the domestic space becomes a focus of propaganda in post-war America amidst Cold War anxieties. Women participated in the labour force in World War II only for employers to solidify the pre-war division of labour in peacetime. This leads to the proliferation of media images of the idealized, hyper-feminine, subservient domestic goddess as a counter to women's increased economic dependence in the 50s and the 60s. Elaine Tyler May describes how images of idealized domesticity were used to subordinate women, and that the family seemed to offer a psychological fortress against the anxieties of the Cold War. Joanne J. Mayowitz states that in this ideological climate, independent women threatened the social order. Under cultural pressure and with limited options for work outside the home, women, contained and constrained, donned their domestic harnesses, and that this serves to downplay women's agency and to portray women primarily as victims. Merricat and Constance, located within the semantically loaded domestic space, are perpetrators of violence rather than victims, and exhibit agency through primitive witchcraft and the construction of alternative feminine spaces. The castle becomes the fortress of the domestic imaginary, a stronghold against invasive masculine economic force in the form of both the villagers and cousin Charles. In being painted as, and in being, murderesses or complicit in murder, poisoners, recluses, and general outcasts, Merricat and Constance are emblematic of the threat of economically independent women in the ideological climate of Cold War America. Finding no welcoming, livable space within post-war society, they create a world of their own, reclaiming the trappings of domesticity, which become warped, magical, and dangerous weapons in the hands of ferociously independent women. This nostalgic American housewife in the horrific imagination has a long and noble history, perhaps most recognisably in Ira Levin's Stepford Wives, and more recently in the animatronic mother of the Umbrella Academy. I've also been thinking a bit lately about Bewitched and I Dreamed of Jeannie, which both appeared in the 1960s, 1970s, and also of the figure of Aunt Helda in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, who coincidentally, well, not coincidentally, murders a character called Shirley Jackson with a poison cupcake. The Cold War emphasized the importance of the American housewife to the political, cultural, social, emotional, and sexual stability of the United States, and suggested that the domestic role of American women served national needs. Merricat and Constance's dislocation from the rest of the village, and thus the rest of the nation, demonstrates resistance to this national narrative and a refusal to serve the nation's needs. The notion of the home as fortress or stronghold derives from the idea that, quote, as atomic weaponry rendered traditional masculine forms of defense obsolete, women and the home become the new battlefront, end quote. This fuels Jackson's use of the woman's domestic homestead as a site of violence and destruction, as the accoutrements of feminine domesticity, food, meals, their associated nourishment and stability, instead become vehicles for poison. The images used to uphold the status quo become disruptive. Indeed, this identification was so strong that in 1956 the knowledge of civil defence was made one of the requisites in the judging of the Miss America pageant. The strategies which women were encouraged to deploy in this new era of defence drew from traditional housewifery. Further, campaigns such as Grandma's Pantry harked back to the skills and abilities of pioneer women, encouraging housewives to stockpile essential groceries they would need to provide for their families in the event of an atomic attack. Constance and Merricat's food stores, already mentioned today in the two previous papers, hold the same significance, as well as clearly from our presentations, a lot of symbolic weight. But these defense strategies exist to protect them from the patriarchal outside world rather than from atomic warfare. Jackson identifies the locus of the threat, not in the realities of atomic war, but in the regressive and limiting ideologies generated as a result of these continued threats and the structures that maintain and perpetuate them. This economic autonomy is reiterated as Constance insists, you will not ask them. We do not ask from anyone. Remember that. These images of womanhood as bound up in domestic space as a microcosm for national stability are inextricably entwined with booming consumerism in this period. In the 1950s, the American economy grew by 37%, and over a decade, the median American family gained 30% more purchasing power. Unemployment dropped to just 4.5%. This massive boost came after the Great Depression, came after the very tight purse strings of World War II. People had been living on the bare minimum for a long time, and now consuming became both possible and extremely desirable. Consuming was wrapped up in American patriotism. There was more to consume than ever before. Between 1945 and 1949, Americans purchased 20 million fridges, 21.4 million cars, and 5.5 million stoves. Domestic appliances were bound up in national stability and identity, and personal status was analogous to national success. Televisions were appearing in people's homes, and Jackson would have seen the advent of televisual advertising promoting the domestic ideal, the nuclear family, the subservient wife, life in the suburbs, the white picket fence. And it's these exact images of mid-century Americana that Jackson inverts and perverts in her work which recurrently makes the familiar and the mundane unfamiliar and threatening. Further, Jackson wrote for women's magazines, which perpetuated these images of mid-century womanhood, and her own memoirs are centered on the challenges and rawness of otherwise glossy and romanticized domesticity. So she punctures through these idealized visions in her wider body of work. Merricat and Constance, then, are terrifying because they embody both the domestic ideal and the horrors of deviancy. Merricat's androgyny and possessive feelings towards Constance render her almost the husband of the family, with that infantilization of Uncle Julian placing him in the position of their child. Constance, in taking control of the processes of consuming through cooking, rejects and resists the consumption of herself as a commodified object. Writing on food in Gothic literature, Elizabeth Andrews says, "Female was the object of consumption and was thus denied appetite and depicted as starving and starved. This also communicated the taboo of female appetite, a taboo that persists and changes within the Gothic as the female assumes the status of subject and the power to devour. She moves from being ethereal to bestial in the 19th century. With her renewed hunger, she becomes a consumer, devouring the villain who would eat her alive." Constance and Merricat's keen appetites demarcate them as women of renewed subjectivity, bestowed with the power and agency to devour. Andrea Adolph states that female consumption provides a basis for explorations of many aspects of female experience and of constructions of femininity, and that the idea of a consuming female anticipates social and cultural anxieties about female empowerment and agency, as Shelley has already spoken to beautifully. For Adolph, images of food, preparation, storage, serving, and eating tie into multifarious images attached to womanhood, from nurturing to mothering to breastfeeding to sexuality. Stella's coffee shop is a relative sanctuary in the village, and it's no coincidence that this is a place dominated by a woman forging her own economic path through the provision of sustenance, as, quote, "Stella bought her coffee urn and put it in the marble counter with the insurance money when her husband died, but otherwise there had been no change in Stella since I could remember," end quote. This makes Stella more tolerable than the other villagers, as "I sometimes thought when I wished all the village people dead that I might spare Stella, because she was the closest to kind that any of them could be." In the text, food is often drawn parallel to money. Merricat buries money in the ground as Constance buries food in the cellar. As the house burns down around them, Constance is worried about these preserves. The food preserved by generations of Blackwood women is an inheritance of more worth than the capitalistic and material inheritance of the property and its trinkets. As Rob mentioned, this is where the value lies. The preserves represent the ways in which women's domestic and emotional labour are unrecognised. Indeed, the preserves are manifest of a feminine economy that actively resists patriarchal capitalism through creating and producing rather than purchasing. The food store is a sort of bank account, more meaningful than whatever money Charles assumes is in the safe. Joyce Carol Oates states that witchcraft is a primitive attempt at science, an attempt to assert power by the powerless, end quote. But in other ways, it is also an attempt at cooking. Merricat is denied access to the tools and materials of cooking of which her elder sister has control. Constance uses cooking to provide stability, structure, and regularity, to enforce a type of order over the chaos induced by the poisoning. Merricat, deprived of the instruments of food preparation, instead tries to create order and stability and structure through her rituals as a way of attaining power. That both of these modes of organisation are feminised, cooking and witchcraft, suggests that both are modes or activities resistant to the dominant infiltrating power structure. Oates states that, quote, "Traditionally, witchcraft, like voodoo and spiritualism, has been the province of marginal individuals, of whom most are women and girls," end quote. The image of ritual recurs in the sacrifices or offerings brought to the women by the repentant villagers. Sometimes they brought bacon, home cured, or fruit, or their own preserves. Mostly they brought roasted chicken, sometimes a cake or a pie, frequently cookies, sometimes a potato salad or coleslaw, sometimes there were pots of baked beans or macaroni. Note how the vast majority of those things are prepared at home rather than just store-bought. Oates refers to these provisions as, quote, "the very eros of food, an astonishing wishful female fantasy in which the agoraphobic is not pitied but revered, idolised. The destruction of her house isn't death to her, but a new life protected by magic," end quote. The sisters in this fulfilled fantasy are no longer purchasers but consumers who have exited the capitalist system, which brought them terror and anxiety. no longer obliged to traverse to the village in search of groceries, and instead they are provided with products in exchange for their own loss. The cost of exiting the consumerist cycle is their property, their heritage, and what some would perceive as their freedom. Rather, the women create a freedom of their own definition and of their own design within a domestic sphere of not only their own creation, but their own reclamation from the ashes of their inheritance. Gone are the bedrooms, the heirlooms, even the roof. And all that remains is the space which Constance and Merricat have made their very own. Vitally, that space is the kitchen, the locus of gendered domestic labour, the locus of the American dream, a hub of stability, the heart of the home and the heart of the nation. Numerous critics, including Daryl Hattenhauer and Paul Carroll, have noted that the idyll created within the Blackwood mansion at the novel's conclusion can be read as Eden, as Rob has also mentioned, where all is ritual, food, incest, and peace. Guy Davenport claims that the sisters are restored to the Edenic innocence of a Crusoe island. But while Crusoe attempts to replicate the patriarchal capitalist structures in his new world, Constance and Merricat consciously create something resistant to those systems. Merricat and Constance, in shaping an Eden centered on food and femininity, create an Eden where Eve can indulge in as many apples as she wishes. The eating of the apple ultimately represents a moment of fracture when Eden becomes separated from the rest of the world and Adam and Eve are expelled and humanity is forever tainted. Yet Merricat and Constance are expelled to an Eden of their own creation, forever eating without any threat of expulsion, representative of the strength of their agency, their dependence from systems of masculine authority. This Eden is further conjured by the sisters' dislocation from consumerism in regards to fashion. Merricat makes a toga from a tablecloth, and Constance jokes that she will wear leaves. They become witches on the hill, benevolent goddesses left baskets by the villagers who fear them. These baskets are offerings, payment, apology, but vitally demonstrate a feminine economy, an exchange between women, orientated around food and consuming. The novel centres on the value of women's spaces and women's work, where Cousin Charles is the embodiment of patriarchal consumer capitalism, and his intrusion on their precarious isolation is represented as an act of violence. In rejecting him, Merricat creates a sanctuary which exists outside of normative social and economic systems, where women's work and relationships are centered and celebrated, and the domestic ideal as a tool of the patriarchy or a weapon of the state is reclaimed and remodeled into a feminist utopia. Thank you very much.
Joan, thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. Several new ways for me, and I'm sure for others too, to think about this novel that we may have not thought of before. We're going to switch over to a Q&A now, so I'll turn that over to Colin Bond, who will facilitate.
Hello. Yeah, I just want to quickly introduce myself before that. I work in the Arts and Social Studies Library, so I'm not an academic in any way, but I am an avid reader of Shirley Jackson, and I'm absolutely delighted to get the chance to ask you a few questions about her. I also curate the content for the BookTalk blog, which we have. So to our audience members, if at the end of this Q&A you're desperate for more stuff about Shirley Jackson, do Google Cardiff BookTalk and head over there, and there's more stuff for you to enjoy. So my first question that I've been sort of curious about, we would, Christy, I know you read this story, the novel earlier this summer, and one of the things that we were sort of chatting about afterwards was the actual murder at the center of it. And I hope this isn't a terrible spoiler for anyone who's halfway through the book. I don't imagine it is, because it's kind of obvious that Merricat has murdered almost everyone in her family. Why she's not in jail, I don't know. Her uncle, Uncle Julian, is writing a book about the murders, which is hundreds and hundreds of chapters long, and it seems that it will never be finished or shed any illumination on the murders whatsoever. And I think, Christy, you were saying, trying to establish some sort of motive for why she had done this and what really is the story behind it. And Ruth Franklin, in her biography, mentions quite tantalizingly that in early drafts of the novel, Shirley Jackson does explain this backstory in more detail. And I think the question that I'm coming to is it a good thing that Shirley Jackson completely expunged all of this from the story? Would it be less of a story if we knew more about it? And how does this work? It seems like the big thing is invisible to us. Who would like to pitch in on that? Robert, you're smiling.
Yeah, sure. I'll kick it off. I mean, my answer, I think, is absolutely that if it had been kind of set out in detail, it would lessen the impact of it. One of the great joys of this novel is not just making your own kind of interpretation of it, but reading what other people think. And in so many of the interpretations I've read, there are kind of accounts for why Merricat is this kind of, what is her kind of motivation? I mean, on one level, she is clearly, be careful about the terms, but she clearly has a degree of psychosis, you could say. So in some ways, there is a kind of element of not being completely in control of her actions, and therefore she, kind of responds much more to the immediacy of her emotions and what she feels and kind of acts out on them. Whereas other people kind of point to the fact that it's kind of an act of self-preservation, that one of the things that is happening to Merricat whilst the family are alive is that she's being constantly marginalized. I mean, Constance talks about the fact that she's so often sent to her bed as a wicked child who's not permitted to join the family around the table. And there is a very real sense that if she doesn't kind of make her presence felt, that she will disappear completely. So it's an ultimately destructive form of kind of self-expression, but it very clearly announces her presence, and it also rebalances, as I think as all of us have kind of touched on, this pronounced gender imbalance that exists in the kind of the standard American family of this period. And it is a way to try and reclaim some kind of agency outside of the role as just daughter or proficient domestic laborer, or however you want to describe it. It kind of it enables them to create this space in which they can exist as they would like to be, rather than they are compelled to be by their kind of gender expectations of the time.
Okay. Just before I put the question on someone else, I just said all the people watching this at home, it is possible if you go down and click on the little box that says Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom meeting to ask some questions, and we would like to hear from as many of you as possible tonight. Joan, what?
I'll go.
Stand up. Shoot.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that's a fantastic question. This idea of Uncle Julian working on this Infinite project feels like it's tied into a longer history of things like Casaubon in George Eliot's Middlemarch, his Eternal book, and Lily's painting in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse as well. And I sometimes think that Jackson does these strange things that just kind of very insidiously suggest just how incredibly terrifyingly well read she is, and it's very much about the idea of the frustration of the author as well. But I also think there's quite a bit in her novels that responds to the American detective fiction tradition and asserts it and perverts it in really fun ways. And you can see that definitely in Hangs a Man, the idea of, the idea that was attached to Hangs a Man by the publisher of the missing girl narrative. And there's often sort of a crime afoot that's being solved. And Julian plays this kind of absurd sleuth figure. And I think part of the rejection and the assertion of that tradition is it's very much reliant upon rational explanation. And a lot of what Jackson's doing is making a mockery of the possibility of rationale, and also pointing out how gendered the privilege of rationale is, as opposed to more abstract feelings of spirit or emotion. So I think it works on a level of a literary tradition, but also a more complex gender criticism as well.
I've taught this book for a lot, probably 20 times in the last 10 years. And my students are always looking for that motive. And what's really interesting is the way in which they recoup, they want to morally recoup Merricat. So they love this character, right? They love her. And they want to root for her. And so they go searching in the novel for this motive that would make everything make sense. And I don't know if you've seen the film, but the film does exactly what The recent film does exactly what my students do, right? They look in this text for the clues that will make it make sense. And I try to push them to think about how it might not make sense. That what if she killed them because she wanted to kill them? What does that say? What does that mean about us as readers trying to find this connection with this character? But I do think it's also about like, it's Merricat's perhaps her first act of agency, I think, as others have said, right? And her, she figured out how she could make the world that she wanted to make. And she realized that as long as she was in this family that was constructed as it was, as long as they were denying her food, then she couldn't have that family. So she figured out, this is what I need to do in order to recreate my world in order to create the world the way I want to live in it.
Okay. Christy, did you have I think you had a question, didn't you?
Well, I have thought of a few, but I'll just start with one right now so we can get to the audience questions as well. I see those starting to tick up, which is wonderful. So as Joan was speaking, I was thinking about another kind of literal type question, kind of like Collins, about how to interpret the end of the novel. So I was thinking that perhaps they had both passed on, right? That they had both died, and that they were living this kind of ghost-like existence. I know Joan said near the end of your presentation that they end up being witches on a hill, which doesn't I don't know much about like witch lore necessarily. I don't know if perhaps that kind of reading places them somewhere between human and specter, or like, so I was just kind of like, that's kind of a very basic question, but how should we read the ending? Are they human? Are they non-human? Were they always non-human? Does it matter? I guess that's my question.
My students are obsessed. So I haven't taught this as much as Shelley, but I've taught it a couple of years now, and I have the same thing, Shelley. They're obsessed with finding out the motive. They forget how old Merricat is. They always think she's a child, even though in the first line it says she's 18. And the third thing they love is the idea that at least Merricat is dead, because Julian thinks she's dead. Julian is referring to the tragedy of her loss and almost referring to her as a ghost. And I think all of these interpretations are equally valid, and I think Jackson would have adored all of them. I think part of the joy of it is entering into that discourse about the very slender line between fantasy and reality, real, unreal, life, death, and the idea that these two girls are haunting this house while potentially being alive. I know is definitely something Rob can talk more about in his work on spectrality, but I love the idea of whether they're living or dead, the idea of kind of the living ghost haunting the abandoned house, I think is very powerful.
I think about it. Oh, go ahead.
No, Shelley, you go ahead, honestly.
Well, I was thinking about it in connection to Hangs a Man. And you haven't read Hangs a Man, but at the end there's questions about whether or not one of the primary characters is a real person, and Jackson really writes her as a mythic figure, and there's a line in it where it talks towards the end where she's talking about this character being on the clouds looking down, right? That there's this real sense of this character being otherworldly. I see the end of We've Always Lived in the Castle as very earthly. Like I do see it as earthly. I do see it as they've become part of the local economy, as Joan was saying, that they've become part of the local lore. I think that it's the beginning of spectrality. Like I think towards the, in 30 years, they may not be there, but their story will be. So this is like the origin story of the haunted house. But I love to play around with the idea that Merricat has been dead the whole time. I think it's fun. It's compelling. It really makes you think about like Joan was saying, right? The line between reality, what's real and what isn't. I keep thinking about Hangs a Man again, but there's a place where it kind of switches, where the third person narration in Hangs a Man is so close to Natalie that you forget that it's third person and it feels like it's first person. Like there's this, it's like this slip between who is telling the story. And I think with We've Always Lived in the Castle, being told from this first person point of view really kind of drives that interiority home. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this is Merricat's interior. It's the only novel that Jackson writes in first person. And I think that that's important. And I think that because of that, because Merricat doesn't quite see the, like Joan was saying, we see she's arrested. There's a bit of arrested development where she's 18, but she's not like she's still 12, right? And the way she doesn't have, it's hard for her to always connect cause and effect. So there's this great line where she talks about men in overcoats. Pulling great, I can't remember the line exactly, but she's talking about firefighters and she doesn't know how to describe that line, right? Like that reality doesn't make sense to her. So all of that is to say, I think that you can read the end of We Have Always Lived in the Castle as just a fully interpolated into Merricat's own perspective. And that perspective does not always understand reality in the same way that we do.
I mean, I just very quickly, just to kind of round it off. I mean, so my kind of thing is kind of reading figurations of spectrality into arrangements where they might not necessarily be there.
That's right.
What I think, I mean, I completely agree with what Shelley said. I think what separates, say, We Have Always Lived in the Castle from, say, Hangs a Man or The Bird's Nest is that Merricat is actually successful, I think, at kind of getting beyond this a kind of self-figuration spectrality. I mean, as I was saying, this kind of adolescent liminality, the fact that she kind of exists in this very attenuated form. In other novels, the kind of women can't quite get beyond that. Whereas We're Always in the Castle, I think they do. I mean, they do very much kind of, she is able to kind of push beyond this and kind of achieve for herself a more consolidated and secure sense of identity. I mean, it is itself a kind of, a heightened one. They're very much, it's not a practical arrangement by any means. I mean, they live in a house which has no roof. But what's important, I think, is that Jackson, you're not going to focus on those details. They have secured for themselves a kind of sense of self and place that is secure. And that is what matters. And that's kind of, I think Bernice Murphy says that, Merricat is pretty much the only main Jackson protagonist who is actually happy, who actually ends the novel happy. And I think that's right. And I think that's absolutely what is going on in this novel. And I think it's fitting that is Jackson's final kind of completed novel, is to have the character who is able to get that sense of security that she herself was so lacking.
I have a question here from Matt, and I was actually thinking of asking something about how Shirley Jackson writes about trauma. It seems like if you mentioned Hangs a Man, which does seem to be something that's happening in that book. The question is, and it's from Matt, we know that Julian is obsessed with writing and rewriting his remembrance of the night he and his family were poisoned. Could it be that the mental trauma of living with that night and the subsequent decline in his memory led to the theme of witchcraft? So I guess basically, does trauma connect with the way that Shirley Jackson writes about witchcraft in the novel? Joan, you're nodding.
I was nodding in encouragement that other people speak. Yes. I think I really like that this question came out of thinking about Uncle Julian in particular, because while Jackson doesn't write as explicitly about the writerly experience as other Gothic authors, the Gothic has always been a genre very concerned with the production of the text and dislocation from the production of the text. I think that Julian does kind of embody this notion as writing as an attempt to process trauma. And I think Jackson, through Julian and through even Natalie's diaries in Hangs a Man, there's this awareness of the idea of writing as an attempt to impose a linear narrative upon experience which isn't linear or organized. It's an organizing structure in the same way as Merricat's rituals, Constance's cooking. There are characters that run rife through Shirley Jackson's narratives who develop coping mechanisms for processing the non-linearity, the strangeness of experience. I've always thought that Jackson's novels aren't Gothic in as much as they deal with supernatural ghosts. They're Gothic in as much as they deal with the fact that experience is Gothic. It's strange, it's uncanny, there's weird coincidences everywhere. And I think that real Gothic is something that Julian's really wrestling with throughout the narrative. So that's a really great question.
Shelley, do you have any thoughts?
I was just thinking about Jackson herself talks about how she writes to keep from going insane. I mean, that's what she says. That writing is what keeps her sane. And I am not surprised at all. I think about the kind of work that Uncle Julian is doing to try to make sense of his world, right? To try to make sense of what happened. And I see that as very much kind of reflective of a part of Jackson's personality herself. You see that explicitly in Hangs a Man, but you also see it in like Hill House, right? There is a lot about reading and writing and Hill House as well. I mean, in Sundial, they take all the books out of the library and burn them and replace them with canned food. So this idea, and the Boy Scout got like handbook, and like that's the way that we signal that this family in the Sundial is not really all like there's something weird going on there. But yeah, I think I'm not sure I'm trying to connect it to the idea of witchcraft, except that it's a type of magic, that writing as a type of magic is a real theme that you see throughout a lot of her work.
Yeah, she nails the book to the tree, right?
Absolutely.
Well, and that's clearly, she's trying to control the environment in that sort of way. I mean, that's classic someone dealing with trauma, isn't it? That's yeah. Robert, did you want to add anything?
No, I think Joan and Shelley have nailed it, really.
To the tree.
Yeah, to the tree.
Thank you.
And there's some kind of something has happened, right, to Merricat, and I mean family wise, because there's that really eerie passage where one of them says that the family deserved to die for whatever it is that they did. So there's this kind of maybe unknown level of trauma as well that we don't even know really what's happened.
Yeah, I mean that is certainly true. I mean, one of the things that critics kind of point out a lot is the degree to which Jackson's young women are kind of subject to various forms of sexual assault. I mean, I don't want to kind of spoil Jackson's oeuvre for people who want to read it, but in so many of her novels, young women are kind of consistently subject to kind of, improper violent kind of sexualities, which impinge on their sense of selfhood. So in Hangs a Man, it is implied that Natalie is kind of sexually assaulted, and this kind of provokes this traumatic split in herself. The same thing in The Bird's Nest, where kind of Elizabeth Richmond's dissociative identity is kind of, it is implied kind of could be traced back to a scene of sexual assault in her childhood. I'm not sure about whether it's the case with Merricat. I'm kind of inclined to think that it's not so much in this case. I think it's going back to what Shelley was saying, that it's kind of looking for a kind of psychological mechanism that accounts for the complexity that she embodies. And I'm inclined to think that it's a little bit too, and also I don't think Jackson would be so reductive as to kind of continually recycle this motif. I think what she does with it, she does something interesting with it in each instantiation. So although Constance does say, it's one of the reasons she gives for not calling the police as soon as it happens is, these people deserve to die. It's kind of, I think, more interesting to read that in a kind of more social sense, the kind of the way that the family kind of constructs and constricts what women can do, rather than always locating it in this kind of primordial scene of sexual assault or something. It's interesting. I mean, I'd be open to be persuaded as a reading like that, but I think that is much more clearly articulated in some of Jackson's other work. And in Castle, there's more to it than that. There's more stuff going on, I think, than just that.
And it's more frightening, right? Like the idea that they've killed off their entire family because they represent some kind of terrible heteronormative repressive structure. The idea of killing your family because they've assaulted, you've experienced state childhood abuse. We can understand that. That's justifiable in a way. That's a rationalization of it. But the idea that they just killed them because they represent a repression that they don't enjoy is significantly more disturbing.
Yeah. It's kind of like, it's a bit like the escalation of Eleanor in Hill House, where there's a suggestion that she has just basically let her mother die of neglect, and Jackson takes it one step further in the next novel and actually has Merricat actively killing her mother kind of intentionally. So it would be fascinating to, I'm sure the work exists, but to trace the relationship between mothers and children, particularly daughters, from Jackson's earliest novels through to her latest ones, it would make for such an interesting chronology.
Okay, a question from Julie. She says she stumbled across Shirley Jackson at her local bookshop, and she would like to know, why do you think Jackson is generally unknown these days, particularly in the UK, and how has she become a forgotten author? And we would like to pitch in with that. Shelley, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, so she was much more unknown 10 years ago, right? So she is like where, and in fact, the only book that has been in print continually is Hill House. So, she was known for Hill House. She was known for the lottery. In the last decade or so, especially with, starting with the publication of Ruth Franklin's biography, she's becoming more well known. But and she was quite well known in her era. Like, she was quite well known in the 50s and 60s as a writer of these funny sketches, right? As a writer of these. She wrote a lot in women's magazines, and we can't forget the import of the lottery, which came out in 1948 and was, hugely impactful. But I think what happened in between, I have lots of ideas about it. Now, one of which is being that she wrote so beautifully that people weren't always aware that she was writing things that were also so important. That treating her like a genre writer, I think, as knowing what she was from the Hill House and even not Hill House, the lottery, and the lottery is great, but kind of tagging her as a genre writer really led to critical ignorance of her work, right? Like there was a lot of, she's always been read, she's always been taught, she's always been researched, but not on a really large scale. One of the things that I realized is that she's she's a writer. Like, I have a lot of friends who are creative writers and creative writing professionals, and they've never not read Jackson. She's such a writer's writer, that she's always been kind of in that conversation. But yeah, so I'm going to go with she's a woman who wrote genre fiction, and people didn't like genre fiction.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the neatest explanation. It does account for a great degree of kind of snobbery and kind of gender discrimination. Lynette Carpenter talks about the way in which Jackson had to kind of balance these two sides of her writing persona, between the woman who wrote for commercial, widely accepted female magazines, kind of domestic sketch pieces, and then also trying to be taken seriously as a kind of a writer of Gothic fiction, as if there's some. I think it's such a false opposition to kind of draw between those, because the Gothic this Gothic sensibility permeates all of her writing. So I think she has not been particularly well served by some of the critical responses to her. I think that is also certainly true. It's interesting, because one of the things that strikes me so much about Jackson is that even now, when we're kind of talking about how in the last 10 years or so she's seen a resurgence, the slight kind of question I have over all this is that, are we just talking about the most visible parts of her corpus just becoming more visible? So we always go back to the lottery and Hill House, and to a lesser extent Castle, I think, but even Castle kind of now comes into it. We don't really, in kind of popular or public discourse, hear much discussions of Bird's Nest or Sundial or even the other short stories that accompanied the lottery. So when we talk about Jackson, we're always, I think, in danger of talking about her as an already attenuated writer. That we identify her with a handful of texts. She wrote more than 200 short stories. The woman was incredibly prolific. When you consider that the majority of her texts were written in the space of about 15 years, from mid-1940s through to the early to mid-1960s, her output is just phenomenal. I don't know if people are kind of familiar with the novel that she was writing at the point she died, which is called Come Along With Me, which is such an interesting text because it's kind of like if Eleanor had got out of Hill House and kind of had married and was kind of wanted to kind of explore, got rid of her husband and kind of fancy, there's so much interest and possibility in that. And it's so, I wonder as well, partly whether it's just because, she didn't die, she didn't live to be very old. She was only 48 at the time that she died.
There does seem to be this incredible myth that when she died, she was like this reclusive, sort of washed up alcoholic who couldn't leave the house. And I gather from Ruth Franklin's book that that's a bit of that's just not true.
No, exactly. And that kind of had defined her, I think, around the time that she was writing Castle and in the immediate aftermath. But at the point that she dies, she is really on an upward swing. She was hitting this new stride of productivity, and would, I don't want to get emotional about it, but to think of the stuff that she could have written had she lived just another, decade, we could be talking about one of the most prolific authors of the 20th century. And I wrestle with this question of why she is kind of both well known and very poorly known. And I can never quite put my finger on it. I think there are so many different reasons, and they all intersect with one another. But I'm kind of, taking it as my mission to try and convert one person at a time, just to read more of her. Just don't stop at Hill House or Castle. Just get all of her stuff and read it. You will.
Sundial, I read for the first time this summer. That is an absolute cracker.
Yeah,
It is.
Yeah, it's just.
Yeah. Well, I won't say any more about that. So, Joan, I think we haven't had your thoughts on this question.
I'm gonna poke the white elephant in the room, Colin, and say misogyny.
Yeah.
Yes.
Outright friggin' misogyny is what underlies all of the ideas that Shelley and Rob were more eloquently describing in a more sophisticated way than I can. But she was a woman who was difficult and awkward, who wrote about difficult, awkward, grotesque women and teenage girls. And that's not very palatable even now. She was also a woman who wrote for domestic women's magazines, so she was very much tarred with that brush. She had a husband who repressed her in every way, shape or form possible, including after her death. She has been horrifically portrayed in biographical accounts of her since. A colleague recently posted a photograph of a brief bio of her in an anthology that culminates in her dying as an overweight smoker. So this distaste for the physicality of her is something that we don't do when we're talking about Hemingway or Henry James. It's something very much reserved for women. And obviously we have women in the canon, going far back, but I think there's something very specific about Jackson's slipperiness and resistance and radicalism and her body and her motherhood, because she can't easily fit into the feminist camp either. She can't be reclaimed as easily as a Virginia Woolf figure, because she's also a mother who writes memoirs about domesticity. So she couldn't be reclaimed in the kind of feminist project. She's not sat very comfortably with men in academia. And I think she's just fallen through the cracks because she was so unique.
The pound of butter, I saw it come up over and over again on a friend's social media post who had read Shirley Jackson because I had said, what, you need to read this novel, right? And like the first response was, didn't she eat a pound of butter a day? Right? I mean, there's like this mythic pound of butter that follows her everywhere. And that's always, and I did some research on this because I looked on comments on things about Jackson for the last 5 years, and you found the pound of butter on almost everything. And And that was how people were thinking about her legacy, was she ate a pound of butter a day.
We are overrunning, so I think the consensus that we have in our little WhatsApp group is we're happy to keep asking questions for a bit longer if our audience sticks with us. If people do have better things to do, hard though that is to imagine, we won't blame you if you do all start signing off. But the next question that I wanted to ask, Leslie has written something to say the garden seems to be something that plays an important part to both Merricat and Constance. They grow things there, they hide things in it. I think as well, think about her other books, gardens seem to play a bit of a role in some of her other books. What do our panelists think of the way Shirley Jackson writes about gardens and perhaps nature more generally?
I recently taught the possibility of evil to first-year undergraduates on this notion of gardens, a short story of Jackson's where very loved, groomed roses play a role in obviously a very kind of haunting, hilarious Shirley Jackson way. So it is an image that recurs throughout her work. I think kind of my very simplistic, superficial understanding of it is this idea of gardening as a way of taming nature, as a kind of grooming, a way of containing the wilderness, whereas the garden, and we have always lived in the castle, is very consciously more of a wilderness, which represents these ideas of witchcraft. It represents, adolescence of the teenage girl. It represents Merricat's own state of mind, especially this kind of bower she constructs for herself, this kind of space that she makes. It's almost reminds me kind of like the fairy queen, that the medieval emerald bower is something that she's tapping into. So my interpretation would be it's a way of again, this process of kind of ordering something chaotic and primal, but there are probably infinitely more interesting ways of thinking about it.
There's, in the early chapters of Castle, there's a few references made to how the townsfolk resent them for not cultivating their land as farmers, which I guess is kind of ties into what you're saying. It's like ideas of what nature is and what it's for.
But what privilege is that for them not to have to do that?
Exactly.
When you have an agrarian population of people living in mid-America who rely entirely upon crops and farming the land, and they have all this land and they just leave it infertile. Like, that's really loaded symbolically. The idea of having the privilege to leave that land unfertilized is, yeah.
There is a Marxist reading of the novel, isn't there? That is, that they're sitting on all of this inherited wealth and the townspeople are quite right to come and burn it down.
Right.
Especially with the origin of the Gothic novel being in like the French Revolution.
Right.
At this time, we get kind of the perspective of the revolution from those being revolted against.
It's a very interesting motif, the garden, because if we think about it in terms of Castle, I suppose we have to kind of demarcate, say, the garden from the land, which could be. If we focus on the kind of the immediate surrounding garden that Constance uses, there it's very much a kind of extension of her kind of the nurturing relationship she has with Merricat. It's a kind of it's a source of nourishment for both of them. It's a way that she expresses her love and fealty towards Merricat. So it's kind of an extension of that thing. If you think about a novel like Hangs a Man, though, again, I don't want to kind of go into too much detail, but the in the opening sections of that novel, where Natalie is at home and the kind of the site of her sexual assault, the garden is kind of the site of that assault. It's kind of the borderline between the garden and this kind of Sylvian wooded enclosure that represents this kind of much more aggressively transgressive sexual potential. So, and also very much in that novel, there is a sense that Natalie is only permitted into the garden to the extent to which her father kind of allows it. It pleases him to see her play in the garden. So the garden in that instance is kind of very much reinforcing a kind of gendered dimension between daughter playing a dutiful role to her father, and then it kind of being flipped on its head and turned into this site of really violent sexual expression. So it'd be difficult to kind of draw much of a line that connects each kind of figuration of the garden across Jackson's work. But it kind of, again, it's always, I think, tied to expressions of women's selfhood, whether kind of positive or negative, and the way that those two things kind of held in tension in terms of what the garden represents. You know, and in the possibility of evil, kind of the way in which the villagers express their, you know, when they discover what Adela Strangeworth has been doing all this time, the way that they make their presence known is by destroying the garden, which is, you know, an extension of her kind of organizing. And, you know, so it's a very interesting question. It's something which I would like to think about in a great deal more detail, and think about other examples that are across her fiction, because I'm sure there are some interesting ones.
Shelley.
I think that's, you know, because now I'm actually thinking about sidewalks, because I've been thinking also about sidewalks in these spaces, you know, paths through gardens, paths through these wilderness spaces, and what they mean. So I think there's a lot to be gained from thinking about, you know, because Merricat always had, she is wild, she is wilderness. And you know, we see at the end of the novel when they go out to her bower, like to her secret place, and then Constance wakes up and she's marked with the same kind of dirt and leaves that Merricat is. That we see how important these kind of natural spaces and movements between these natural spaces are.
Yeah. Okay. A question from Mr. Richards. Having only read some of Shirley Jackson's short stories, where women seem trapped by many things, and then in Castle, where the women, although trapped, do seem to exert more power, what characteristics would her next female character have had, which would have been the character in the book Come Away With Me, isn't it? Robert, you were discussing that, weren't you? So do you want to take this question?
Yeah, sure. So the character in Come Along With Me is called Angela Motorman. And what's interesting about that is that it's a name that she chooses for herself. She is kind of at the start of the novel, she's a blank slate, and she decides one of the things she's going to do in order to secure this new sense of selfhood is she's going to choose a name for her, and that will kind of, you know, kind of become emblematic of this new figuration of herself. So Angela, so at the start of the novel, her husband has died. There's no suggestion that she's killed him, although with Jackson you never know. And then she has basically decided she's going to uproot, she's going to move to the city, start a new life, not look back at all, kind of no longer have to play into these the need to kind of placate people and to, you know, to hide who she is. She's going to embrace this new kind of sense of freedom. And again, that's why I think it's so poignant that it was the novel that Jackson was working on when she died, because, you know, she had finally in her fiction mustered the courage to leave her good-for-nothing husband, and, you know, kind of put that behind her, and, you know, was charting what it could be. And again, it's an interesting novel because it has supernatural overtones. So there's suggestion that she's in touch with the occult, and she conducts seances in the front room of her landlady's house, which are completely unsuccessful. You know, nothing really happens. She's, you know, there's not really a suggestion that there's anything behind it. But it plays into this sense that, I mean, I think Daryl Hattenhauer talks about this, that Jackson is not so much interested in the supernatural as a thing in itself, but the way that it is a metaphor for reality, and the way that that metaphor works in different operations, and in different textual examples. So it's so difficult to say, because you very much get the sense when reading Come Along With Me that it is an unfinished text. You know, there is so much that could be made of this character. But to go from Merricat, where, as we said, she's one of the few Jackson protagonists to have charted a course for herself, which looks a future for herself that looks happy, and then to translate that from an 18-year-old to a 44-year-old woman who, you know, might otherwise feel that she's, you know, the best of her is behind her, to find that kind of rediscovered sense of self, and so it's so interesting. So I'm just going to ramble now, because it's such an interesting question, and I would love to have seen how that narrative resolved itself.
Did any of the others, Joan or Shelley, did you want to have any thoughts about Angela Motorman?
No, I think Rob hit it on the head. Just a profound sense, I suppose, of loss. Again, that Rob referenced before, of not getting more of her output. and that shift in what her female characters, radical for the 1940s, 50s and 60s, are almost becoming more and more radical as time goes on. So I'd love to see where she ended up in 1970.
But please, nobody don't try and complete the novel. Let's just leave it as it is. Don't be one of those people who takes it on themselves to finish the Jackson novel, because I know a few people who would not be best pleased.
So a question from Helen. I've always found the naivety of Merricat's magic quite terrifying in its effectiveness. She manifests her paradise seemingly by intuition. I wondered if the family deserved to die because of their flagrant waste of potential in their daughters. What could the girls have inherited from their foremothers if it wasn't all brined and tightly lidded in the pantry?
Wow.
What's on that? Joan?
Oh, what gorgeous phrasing. What a stunning question. What could they have inherited? Yes, I think there's definitely an anxiety in this novel about, we've already spoken extensively about inheritance, but the idea of what these women are inheriting from other women. And there's I think one of the most interesting moments in the novel is when they're talking about the Blackwood family linens, this kind of linen closet. That always reminds me of Sylvia Plath's Tulips when she's talking about her wedding box. And the idea of the linen closet is always refreshed by new Blackwood women who obviously would not have been Blackwoods. They would have been women coming into and marrying into the family. This notion of kind of fresh blood, rejuvenating this kind of ancient structure, which is very vampiric and again very much tied into this European Gothic tradition. And I think there's a sense of, yes, what are women able to contribute within this limiting system? What are women able to inherit? The girls in their relationship with their mother is they're just kind of preserving this bedroom and laying out the things on the dressing table, not more than an inch than where they're supposed to be. So I think there's work that still needs to be done with this novel and the relationship between with their father and with their mother. And I think there's still little gestures in there that kind of need to be pulled out a little bit more, because I think it's richer and more complicated than initially appears on the surface.
I think one of the interesting things as well about this novel is that it is very heavily implied that her mother is not particularly domestically proficient. I mean, comparison to the other generations of Blackwood women, I mean, she is not particularly, Uncle Julian says famously, about her cooking, I'd rather chance the arsenic. So there is a sense in which possibly she could furnish this model for a slightly more disruptive form of femininity, which Merricat embodies. I mean, I don't think we could say Constance. I mean, Constance is kind of like the personification of, effective domesticity. I mean, that image that Simone de Beauvoir uses of kind of, housework is this Sisyphean undertaking that, you finish it only for it to start again. She has kind of perfected that routine. And then, how she can just create these culinary spectacles with seemingly no effort whatsoever. So there was very interesting tension between the different forms of femininity that Merricat and Constance both practice. And the way I think the Merricat is in some ways closer to her mother, and Constance is perhaps closer to the success of the previous generations who had kind of stocked this cellar full of, culinary treasure. It's interesting. It's interesting to think about that dynamic and to think about how they kind of meet in the middle and kind of maintain, because it is a novel of tensions and of contradictions that are nonetheless held together. And it would be interesting to trace those a little bit more, I think.
Shelley, you?
I don't really have much to add, except, reading this through the lens of fairy tale scholarship, and we're thinking about the kind of the moves of a fairy tale, the morphology of the folktale, as BookTalk calls it, that there has to be an absent mother. So thinking about her as an absent mother before she's even dead allows Merricat to kind of start that process early on. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it, because connecting it to, so the part of Hansel and Gretel that people forget is the part where after they push the witch into the house, they steal the treasure from the witch who lives in the house and brings it back to their father, because their mother had died, and their father is like, oh great, this is wonderful, thanks, come live with me. So he has, so they are kind of rejecting the mother in order to validate the father. They are rejecting the kind of economy of the gingerbread house in order to kind of embrace the treasure kind of economy of the father by bringing it back. And so thinking about how those relationships, I haven't spent too much time thinking about that relationship with the mother in this book. So now I have lots of good ideas that I want to kind of think through more.
Excellent. I think the consensus on the WhatsApp group is that it's probably time to wrap up, and that we don't want to impose any more on our panelists' time. There are a few questions that we haven't got to, and we're going to put those up on our Facebook page so that the debate can continue online. And yeah, if I just invite our panelists to check that out, and we can continue in that sort of way. But yeah, I'm out of here. I just hand over to Christina.
I think I'm going to hand over to Anna.
Can we give our panelists a virtual round of applause?
You're poised to take over, Christy. Sorry.
So it was wonderful to hear those 3 talks tonight, and yes, I'm so much food for thought there. Thank you for 3 fascinating talks, really evocative discussions of the images, the symbolism, and just the general kind of perplexing ambiguity in Jackson's text. I want to go and read it again. It was great. Thank you so much. So thank you to our audience for attending tonight. I'm just going to say, to close up, don't forget to check out our future events by checking out the blog and our website. And do also check your email inboxes for a message from us about how to leave us some feedback on tonight's event, which we'd be really grateful if you could share how you thought it went, especially as the inaugural online session. So thank you if you have time to do that. Next up is Jane Austen's Emma on the 3rd of December at 7 p.m. You can register for this event now, and we hope to see many of you there. Thank you, especially to our speakers and to our audience, and good night.